The phone call came on a cold November morning. I was standing at my kitchen window holding a cup of coffee, watching a bright red cardinal perched on the fence outside my farmhouse. At 63 years old, I had learned to appreciate quiet moments. The farm was peaceful that morning. The fields stretched across the horizon, touched by a thin layer of frost, and for a few precious minutes everything felt exactly as it should. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed my son-in-law's name, Garrett. I answered without concern. At first his voice sounded calm, almost rehearsed. "Vera, I need to tell you something." There was something strange about the way he said it. Something careful. Something that immediately made me stop what I was doing. I turned away from the window and listened. "We've made some decisions about the farm." My hand tightened around the coffee mug. "What kind of decisions?" I asked. Garrett cleared his throat. "Practical decisions. You're 63 now. The property is too much for one person to manage." I felt irritation rise inside me. The farm had been my home for more than 3 decades. I had survived storms, droughts, financial hardships, and the devastating loss of my husband. Yet here was my son-in-law speaking as though I were incapable of making my own choices. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "We found a buyer." The offer was excellent. We already accepted it. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The room seemed to go completely silent. "You accepted an offer?" I asked slowly. "On my behalf," he replied. "Lindsay still had the power of attorney from your hip surgery. We used it. The closing is in 3 weeks." He continued talking after that. He spoke about retirement communities, easier living, fewer responsibilities, and a beautiful assisted living residence with a swimming pool and social activities. But I barely heard any of it. My mind was focused on one thing: my farm. The farm my husband and I had built together, the farm where we raised our daughter. The farm where every fence, every tree, and every stone carried a memory. Garrett kept talking, believing he was explaining something reasonable. I let him finish. I let him explain every detail of the future he had already planned for me without my permission. Then I took a slow breath and said the only thing that came to mind. "Garrett, you should call your lawyer." Silence. "What?" he asked. "Call your lawyer," I repeated calmly. "Tell him exactly what you just told me. Then listen very carefully to what he says." Before he could respond, I ended the call. I placed my phone on the kitchen table and sat down. Outside, the cardinal was still sitting on the fence as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed, because what Garrett didn't know was that 6 weeks earlier, I had already discovered what he and my daughter were planning. And while they thought they were about to take my farm away from me, I had quietly taken steps that were about to destroy their entire plan. After I hung up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time staring at the wood grain beneath my hands. Part of me was angry, part of me was hurt. But more than anything, I kept asking myself the same question: how did we get here? How did the man I once welcomed into my family become the person trying to sell my farm without my permission? To answer that question, I need to go back several years. My daughter Lindsay married Garrett 8 years earlier. The truth is, I liked him in the beginning. Most people did. Garrett had a smile that made him instantly likable, and a way of speaking that made him sound confident about absolutely everything. If a roof needed replacing, Garrett knew the best contractor. If the stock market dropped, Garrett had an explanation. If someone disagreed with him, he always seemed to have a perfectly prepared answer waiting. At first, I mistook confidence for wisdom. My husband didn't. Leonard noticed things I ignored. One evening, after a family barbecue, he sat on our porch watching Garrett load coolers into his truck. "That man worries me," he said. I laughed. "Why?" Leonard took a sip of tea and shook his head. "Because he keeps score." I didn't understand what he meant. Score of what? Leonard looked toward the driveway. "Everything. Favors, conversations, opportunities. People like that don't see relationships the same way other people do. Everything becomes a transaction eventually." I dismissed the comment at the time. Garrett had always been respectful toward me. He brought gifts during holidays. He called occasionally to check on us. He seemed like a devoted husband and father. Looking back now, I realize most of those conversations revolved around information. He was always asking questions. Questions about the farm, questions about finances, questions about long-term plans. At the time, I thought he was simply interested in family matters. Years later, I would understand those questions very differently. Then life changed. 3 years before that phone call, Leonard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. 4 months later, he was gone. Losing him felt like losing the foundation beneath my feet. For 38 years, he had been my partner in every decision. Suddenly, I was making choices alone. During that difficult period, Garrett seemed supportive. He helped organize paperwork after the funeral. He offered advice about property taxes and maintenance expenses. He frequently told me that family would always be there for me. Those words brought comfort when I needed it most. What I didn't realize was that while I was grieving the loss of my husband, Garrett was paying very close attention to something else. The 82-acre farm that now belonged entirely to me. And unfortunately, the opportunity he had been waiting for arrived sooner than I ever imagined. The opportunity arrived in March, disguised as kindness. Looking back, that is what troubles me most. Very few betrayals announce themselves openly. Most arrive wearing the face of someone you love. For nearly 2 years, my doctor had been urging me to have hip replacement surgery. The pain had gradually become impossible to ignore. Walking across the farm took longer. Stairs felt steeper. Some mornings I needed both hands just to stand up from a chair. Eventually, I agreed. The surgery was scheduled for early March. When Lindsay heard the date, she immediately offered to stay with me during recovery. I remember feeling grateful. For the first time in months, it felt like we were reconnecting. She arrived 2 days before the operation and handled everything. She drove me to appointments, helped prepare meals, and reassured me whenever I felt nervous. After the surgery, she stayed by my side constantly. She brought soup, organized my medications, helped me put on compression stockings, and sat beside me in the evenings while we watched old movies together. Those were some of the happiest days I had shared with my daughter in years. I genuinely believed she was there simply because she loved me. 4 days into my recovery, Lindsay walked into my bedroom carrying a stack of papers and a pen. I was sitting in a recliner near the window, still sore and exhausted. The pain medication made everything feel slightly foggy. Not enough to make me unconscious, but enough that concentrating on legal documents seemed impossible. Lindsay smiled and placed the papers on a side table. "Nothing serious," she said. "Just some paperwork to make things easier while you're recovering." I frowned slightly. "What kind of paperwork?" "Just practical things," she replied. "Bills, correspondence, property issues. Garrett and I can help manage everything if anything comes up while you're healing." At the time, her explanation sounded reasonable. I trusted her completely. She pointed to several highlighted tabs and handed me the pen. "Just sign where the markers are." I didn't read the documents. Even now, admitting that embarrasses me. I had spent 63 years teaching myself to be careful. Yet in that moment, I wasn't careful at all. I was tired. I was in pain. Most importantly, I was signing papers handed to me by my own daughter. Why would I suspect anything? 1 signature became 2, 2 became 5. Within 10 minutes, the paperwork was finished. Lindsay collected the documents, kissed me on the forehead, and carried them out of the room. I never thought about them again. Not for months. Life slowly returned to normal. My hip healed. I started walking across the farm again. The garden grew. Summer arrived. Everything seemed peaceful. What I didn't know was that hidden among those pages was a durable power of attorney so broad that it gave Lindsay and Garrett authority over nearly every aspect of my affairs, including real estate transactions. And while I was focused on recovering my health, they had quietly gained the legal tool they needed to put my entire farm at risk. For several months after my surgery, life seemed perfectly normal. My hip grew stronger every week. By early summer, I was walking across the property again without a cane. By August, I was spending entire afternoons in the garden, pulling weeds, harvesting vegetables, and enjoying the simple routines that had always brought me peace. Looking back, I realized that was exactly why I missed the warning signs. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no threats, no arguments, no obvious signs of trouble. Just small things that seemed harmless at the time. Garrett started calling more often. He would ask questions about property taxes, insurance policies, maintenance costs, and whether I had thought about my long-term plans for the farm. I answered honestly. After all, he was family. Sometimes he would send articles about downsizing or retirement communities. Other times he would casually mention how difficult it must be for one person to manage 82 acres alone. I never paid much attention to those conversations. Then one afternoon in September, my neighbor Doyle called. Doyle was 71 years old and had farmed the neighboring property for over 40 years. He wasn't the type of man who wasted words. If Doyle called, there was usually a reason. "Had a visitor yesterday," he said. "What kind of visitor?" I asked. "Some fellow asking questions about your land." That immediately caught my attention. "What kind of questions?" Doyle paused. "Boundary lines, soil conditions, access roads, development potential. My stomach tightened slightly. Who was he? Said he represented a development company. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked toward the fields. Did he give you a name? No. But I can describe him. Then Doyle began describing the man. Tall, dark hair, expensive truck, confident attitude. With every sentence, I felt my pulse beating faster. By the time he finished, I already knew who it was. Garrett. There was no doubt in my mind. After I hung up, I sat quietly at the kitchen table. Part of me searched desperately for an innocent explanation. Maybe Garrett was simply gathering information. Maybe someone had asked him to help with a project. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But another part of me kept remembering all those conversations over the summer. The questions about the property, the comments about my future, the articles about downsizing. Suddenly, those things felt very different. That evening, I barely touched my dinner. Instead, I sat on my porch watching the sun disappear behind the western field. The farm looked exactly the same as it always had. The pond reflected the orange sky. The barn stood quietly in the distance. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet for the first time, I had the uncomfortable feeling that something important was happening behind my back. And deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore that feeling any longer. I spent the entire next day trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation for what Doyle had told me. Garrett was family. Lindsay was my daughter. Surely there was something I didn't understand. Surely there was a harmless reason a development company would be asking questions about my property. But the harder I tried to dismiss my concerns, the stronger they became. By that evening, I decided I needed advice from someone who wasn't emotionally involved. That person was my friend Nola. We had known each other for more than 30 years. She had spent over 2 decades working as a paralegal before retiring, and she possessed a rare ability to separate facts from emotions. The next morning, I met her for coffee in town. As soon as I told her what Doyle had reported, she stopped stirring her coffee and looked directly at me. "Vera," she said, "what exactly did you sign during your recovery?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. That fact alone made me uncomfortable. "Some paperwork," I said. "Lindsay said it was related to helping with bills and correspondence while I recovered." Nola's expression immediately changed. "Did you read it?" I looked away. "No." She nodded slowly, not judging me, just processing the information. "Then that's where we start." That same afternoon, Nola drove me to the office of a lawyer she knew from her working years. We sat together in a small conference room while copies of the documents were pulled from county records. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. I remember staring at the table while the attorney carefully reviewed each page. The silence seemed endless. Finally, he removed his glasses and folded his hands together. It was the expression people wear when they're about to deliver bad news. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, "this document grants a very broad, durable power of attorney." My stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means your daughter was given extensive authority to act on your behalf." "How extensive?" He hesitated for a moment. Then he looked directly at me. "Under the terms of this agreement, she could conduct banking transactions, manage assets, sign legal documents, and execute real estate transactions." I felt my heartbeat accelerate. "Are you saying she could sell my farm?" The attorney nodded slowly. "Yes. Under this document, she could." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I simply stared at the papers lying on the table. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Everything Doyle had told me now made sense. The questions. The development company. Garrett's sudden interest in the property. None of it had been random. They had a legal mechanism. They had authority. And if I hadn't discovered it, they might have completed the entire transaction without ever telling me. On the drive home, I barely spoke. Nola understood and didn't pressure me. My mind kept returning to one painful realization. The most dangerous thing wasn't the document itself. The most dangerous thing was that I had signed it willingly because I trusted my daughter. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to wait and see what happened next. If someone was planning to take my farm, I was going to move first. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I already knew what I was going to do. Fear has a strange way of clarifying things. For days, I had been trying to explain away the warning signs because I didn't want to believe my own daughter and son-in-law might be planning something behind my back. But now I had facts. Facts are harder to ignore than feelings. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sun sink behind the western field. The light spread across the property in shades of gold and amber, illuminating the barn my husband rebuilt after the storm of 2009. the pond where Lindsay learned to fish as a child, and the long stretch of pasture that had belonged to my husband's family since 1951. I wasn't looking at land. I was looking at a lifetime. And I wasn't about to let someone take it away because I had trusted the wrong people. The following morning, I drove to Lexington and met with a different attorney. I intentionally chose someone who had no connection to my family, no connection to Nola, and no connection to any previous legal advice. I wanted complete independence. The attorney listened carefully as I explained everything: the surgery, the documents, Doyle's phone call, Garrett's questions about the property. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "The power of attorney is valid," she said, "but that doesn't mean you're powerless." Those words were exactly what I needed to hear. Over the next 2 hours, we built a plan. The first step was immediate. I signed documents revoking the power of attorney. The attorney filed the revocation with the county clerk's office that same afternoon. From that moment forward, neither Lindsay nor Garrett had legal authority to act on my behalf. But we didn't stop there. The second step was far more important. My attorney recommended placing the entire farm into a revocable living trust, with very specific protections built into the structure. I spent several days reviewing every detail, every clause, every condition, every safeguard. Then I signed the documents. The trust officially became the legal owner of the property. I remained the sole trustee, with complete control. I also appointed Nola as successor trustee and included strict instructions regarding any future transfer or sale of the land. No transaction could occur without my direct written consent, notarized in person and verified through multiple safeguards. In simple terms, the farm became untouchable. Even if someone somehow obtained another power of attorney in the future, they would still be unable to sell the property without overcoming layers of legal protection. The process took nearly 2 weeks. When everything was finished, I drove home and placed the completed trust documents inside a fireproof safe. Then I did something that surprised even me. I told absolutely no one. Not Lindsay. Not Garrett. Not even Doyle. Life continued as though nothing had changed. I planted garlic in the garden. I mowed around the pond. I answered phone calls and attended family dinners. Every Sunday, Lindsay called to ask how I was feeling. Garrett occasionally checked in and continued asking casual questions about the property. I answered politely. I smiled. I listened. And I said nothing. The entire time, they believed they still had control. They believed the power of attorney remained active. They believed whatever plans they were making would eventually succeed. What they didn't know was that every document they intended to rely on had already been neutralized. By the time November arrived, I wasn't waiting for trouble anymore. I was waiting for a mistake. And sooner or later, people who believe they are smarter than everyone else almost always make one. The phone call came less than an hour after Garrett informed me that my farm had already been sold. I was standing by the kitchen window watching the cardinal on the fence when my phone started ringing again. This time it was Lindsay. Before I even answered, I knew she had been crying. Mothers recognize those things. There is a difference between genuine heartbreak and panic disguised as tears. What I heard when I picked up the phone was a mixture of both. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she blurted out before I could say a word. "Please let me explain." I remained silent. Sometimes silence tells people more than any speech ever could. "Garrett thought he was helping," she continued. "He thought this would make life easier for you. He thought you'd be happier somewhere that didn't require so much work." I looked out across the pasture and said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that her voice began to shake. "Mom?" she whispered. Finally, I spoke. "When did this start?" "What? When did the two of you begin talking to developers?" The line went completely quiet. That silence told me more than her answer ever could. Several seconds passed before she finally spoke. "July." I closed my eyes. "July. 4 months. 4 months of family dinners. 4 months of Sunday phone calls. 4 months of asking about my health while secretly planning the future of my property. How many meetings?" I asked calmly. "Mom, how many?" 3. My chest tightened, but my voice remained steady. "And during all that time, neither of you thought I deserved to know?" She started crying again. "We thought we were helping." "No," I said quietly. "You thought you were deciding." Another silence followed. Then I asked the question that truly mattered. "Has the developer been informed that the farm is currently held in a revocable living trust?" The crying stopped instantly. "What?" she asked. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "The trust," I repeated. "Has anyone involved in this transaction been informed that the property was transferred into a trust several weeks ago?" The confusion in her voice was immediate. What trust? For the first time since answering the phone, I smiled, not because I was happy, because I finally understood exactly how little they knew. Mine, I said calmly, established in October, properly filed and legally binding. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever heard from my daughter. It was the sound of someone watching an entire plan collapse in real time. I continued before she could interrupt. The power of attorney was revoked before the trust was finalized. Neither you nor Garrett currently have any authority over my property. Any agreement signed after that revocation was signed without legal authority. I heard her breathing change. Fast, uneven, panicked. Mom, she whispered. The sale is impossible, I said. The trust makes the transaction invalid. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. Does Garrett know this? I looked across the fields toward the old barn and answered honestly. Not yet. In that moment, I realized something important. For months, they had believed they were one step ahead of me. What they didn't understand was that while they were secretly planning the sale of my farm, I had quietly been protecting it. And now their entire future depended on a truth they had never bothered to discover. 3 days after my conversation with Lindsay, the entire situation began unraveling faster than I expected. I wasn't the one who started it. The developer's legal team did. As part of their standard due diligence process, they began reviewing county records before finalizing the purchase. That was when they discovered the trust. By Friday afternoon, Garrett's phone was ringing nonstop. The attorney representing the development company wanted answers. The purchase agreement had been signed under the assumption that Garrett and Lindsay possessed valid authority to act on my behalf. The county records told a very different story. The power of attorney they relied upon had already been revoked. The property itself no longer belonged to me personally. It was owned by the trust. Legally speaking, the entire transaction was built on a foundation that no longer existed. Later that evening, Garrett called. Unlike his confident phone call a few days earlier, this one sounded completely different. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the smooth, professional tone. For the first time, he sounded scared. Vera, he said quickly, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I almost laughed. A misunderstanding. That was an interesting way to describe attempting to sell 82 acres without the owner's knowledge. Is there? I asked calmly. He immediately began explaining how everyone had acted in good faith and how they believed the paperwork was still valid. I listened quietly. Then I asked a simple question. Did you verify the authority before signing the agreement? Silence. Garrett? More silence. Finally, he admitted, no. That single word said everything. He hadn't checked. He assumed. He believed he was in control and never considered the possibility that someone else might be paying attention. The following week, the developer officially withdrew from the transaction. Their attorneys wanted nothing to do with a property tied to a revoked power of attorney and a legally protected trust. The purchase agreement was declared unenforceable. Months of planning vanished almost overnight. The future Garrett and Lindsay had already imagined simply disappeared. What surprised me most was how quickly everyone started distancing themselves from the situation. Advisors became difficult to reach. Emails stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. The same people who had enthusiastically supported the deal suddenly wanted no involvement. By the end of the week, the sale was dead. Completely dead. As I stood on my porch watching the sunset over the western field, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not because I had won, not because someone else had lost, but because the land was still where it belonged. The farm was safe, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the people who tried to control my future were finally being forced to confront the consequences of their own decisions. The collapse of the sale was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the consequences started arriving one after another, and for the first time, Garrett found himself facing a situation he couldn't talk his way out of. The development company had already deposited earnest money into the transaction, and when their attorneys discovered the trust documentation and the revoked power of attorney, they were furious. From their perspective, they had spent time, money, and resources pursuing a deal that should never have existed. The first serious problem came when they demanded repayment of the $17,000 earnest money deposit. Garrett had assumed the sale would close quickly, so he never imagined the deposit could become his responsibility. Unfortunately for him, the purchase agreement contained provisions that made him personally liable if he misrepresented his authority. Suddenly, The man who had spoken so confidently about my future was scrambling to protect his own. Then came the legal fallout. The real estate attorney Garrett had hired reviewed the newly discovered documents and immediately withdrew from representing him. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I later learned it was neither pleasant nor brief. No attorney wants to remain involved when questions of fraud begin appearing in a transaction. Without legal support, Garrett found himself isolated. Worse still, word began spreading through professional circles. People talk, especially in smaller communities. Business associates who once admired his confidence began questioning his judgment. Some stopped returning calls. Others quietly distanced themselves. The damage wasn't dramatic or public. It was slow and personal. The kind of damage that affects reputations built over many years. Lindsay suffered as well. Although she hadn't organized the sale herself, she had participated in it and remained silent for months. The strain between them became impossible to hide. Arguments became frequent. Trust disappeared. Every discussion seemed to return to the same question. How had they allowed things to go this far? 8 months after the failed sale, Lindsay and Garrett separated. When I heard the news, I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. In truth, I felt sad, because no mother dreams of seeing her daughter's marriage fall apart. But I also understood something important. Consequences are not revenge. Consequences are simply what happens when people make choices, and those choices finally meet reality. Garrett wanted control of my future. Instead, he lost control of his own. And as painful as that lesson was, it was one he had ultimately taught himself. 8 months after the sale collapsed, life looked very different from the way it had on that cold November morning when Garrett called to tell me my farm had already been sold. The lawyers were gone. The phone calls had stopped. The developers had moved on to other projects. Even the anger I had carried for so many months had begun to fade. What remained was something quieter, something wiser. One afternoon in March, a few days before my 64th birthday, Lindsay called. This time there were no excuses, no explanations, and no carefully prepared speeches. She simply asked if we could talk, really talk. I invited her to the farm the following Saturday. When she arrived, she looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. There is a certain look people carry after life, forces them to confront difficult truths about themselves. We sat together on the back porch where she used to drink lemonade as a little girl. For a long time, neither of us said much. Finally, she began to cry. "Mom, I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not just for the farm, for all of it." I listened quietly. Then, for nearly 2 hours, we talked more honestly than we had in years. She admitted she had ignored warning signs because trusting Garrett was easier than questioning him. She admitted she had convinced herself they were helping me. Most painfully of all, she admitted that somewhere along the way she had stopped seeing the farm as part of my life and started seeing it as part of her future. Hearing those words hurt. But honesty, even painful honesty, has a way of opening doors that lies keep closed. I didn't forgive everything in a single afternoon. Real healing doesn't happen that way. Trust is built slowly and rebuilt even more slowly. But that conversation was a beginning. After Lindsay left, I walked across the property toward the back ridge, the same path I had walked hundreds of times with my husband. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything gold. I stopped beside the old stone wall Leonard had built years earlier using rocks pulled from the pasture. I sat there for a while and thought about everything that had happened. The truth is, I learned lessons far more valuable than any legal victory. I learned that love and trust are not the same thing. You can love someone deeply and still protect yourself. I learned that getting older does not mean surrendering control of your life. Too many people believe age automatically makes them dependent, fragile, or incapable of making decisions. That simply isn't true. Wisdom means knowing when to ask questions, when to seek advice, and when to stand your ground. Most importantly, I learned that protecting yourself is not an act of suspicion, it is an act of self-respect. Looking back, I don't regret loving my daughter. I don't regret trusting people. What I regret is ignoring my instincts when something felt wrong. If sharing my story helps even one person avoid making the same mistake, then perhaps some good came from all of this. Today, the farm is still mine. The pond still reflects the evening sky. The barn still stands proudly against the horizon. Every spring, I plant my garden. Every autumn, I walk the back ridge and watch the leaves turn gold. And almost every morning, a bright red cardinal lands on the same fence post outside my kitchen window. My husband used to say that land remembers who cares for it. I believe that now more than ever, because in the end, The most important thing I protected was never the 82 acres. It was my right to choose my own future. And as I stood there watching the sunset spread across the farm that evening, I realized something beautiful. At 64 years old, my story wasn't ending. It was simply entering a chapter that belonged entirely to me.